Dave Roberts had called the emergency meeting immediately after the final out. Before the media entered the clubhouse. Before the equipment staff began their post-game routines. Before the ordinary rhythm of a professional baseball team processing a defeat had even begun to establish itself. He called everyone in. And then he said what he had decided. Blake Treinen. Edwin Diaz. Designated for assignment. The room absorbed the announcement in the particular silence that arrives when something genuinely unexpected has just been said, not the silence of shock alone, but the silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about where they stood and what was coming next. 2 pitchers. 2 careers. 2 men who had been part of this organization's competitive identity sitting in a clubhouse listening to the words that professional baseball players understand as the beginning of the end. And then Trinan stood up. What followed, the rebellion, the accusation, the name that Trinan put into the middle of the room with the desperate force of a man who has just been told his professional world is collapsing and is looking for something to hold on to, turned an emergency meeting into the most volatile clubhouse moment of the Dodgers season. He pointed at Roki Sasaki. He's also a culprit. The room, which had been silent, became something else entirely. And somewhere in that room, Shohei Ohtani, who had been sitting with the same quiet composure he brings to every difficult situation, made a decision. He was going to speak. The Dodgers had lost in the way that losses feel most damaging, not through a single catastrophic moment, not through a play that could be isolated and analyzed and eventually accepted as an unfortunate turning point. They had lost through accumulation. Through the slow, grinding erosion of a lead that should have held, through bullpen decisions that did not produce the results the situation demanded, through the specific failure of the pitchers Roberts was now designating for assignment to do the job they had been placed in the game to do. Trinan had been given a specific assignment. A specific inning. A specific set of hitters whose tendencies the scouting report had addressed and whose vulnerabilities the game plan had been designed to exploit. He had gone out to execute that plan with the confidence of a professional who had performed at this level before and believed he could perform at it again. The execution failed. Not partially. The kind of failure that changes a game's outcome completely, that transforms a situation the offense had built into a situation the defense had surrendered. The kind of failure that managers remember when they make the decisions that follow. Diaz had come in after Trinan. His assignment was damage control, the specific challenge of entering a compromised situation and preventing it from deteriorating further. He had been in these situations before. His career had produced performances in high-leverage moments that justified the confidence the organization had placed in him. His performance that night did not justify that confidence. When Robert sat in his office after the final out and made the calls that preceded the emergency meeting, the calls to the front office, the calls to the people whose authority is required before personnel decisions of this magnitude can be executed, he was making them with the specific memory of what he had watched those 2 pitchers do in the innings that had decided the game. The decision was made before the meeting began. The meeting was where it was delivered. Robert spoke first. He addressed the loss in the direct terms that his post-game communication always employs, the honest, unsparing examination of what went wrong that his players have learned to expect from him, however uncomfortable it sometimes lands. He moved through the game's failures methodically. The defensive lapses. The offensive opportunities that went unconverted. The pitching decisions that had not produced the results the situation required. And then he said the words that changed everything. The designations. Treinen and Diaz. Effective immediately. The organizational decision that their roles with the Dodgers were being terminated with the finality that designated for assignment communicates in professional baseball. 11 minutes of meeting. Then Trinan was on his feet. The room registered his movement before he spoke. Players who had been sitting with the weight of the announcement, processing their own reactions to personnel decisions that affected their teammates and implicitly communicated something about the standards the organization was prepared to enforce, watched Trinan rise with the body language of a man who had decided that silence was not an option. He was not calm. This is important to understand. The controlled, measured delivery of someone making a considered argument was not what the room witnessed. What the room witnessed was a man in genuine distress, professional distress, the kind that arrives when a career is suddenly and without sufficient warning being redirected in a direction the player did not choose and did not see coming, expressing that distress in real time without the buffer of composure that more time and more distance might have provided. He challenged the decision. He challenged the framing of what had gone wrong and who was responsible for it. He challenged the organizational logic that had identified him and Diaz as the primary sources of accountability for a defeat that he believed had more contributors than the two names Roberts had called out. And then he said the name. Roki Sasaki. The accusation landed in the room with the force of something thrown hard against a wall. Not because the words themselves were physically threatening, but because of what they represented, the specific decision to redirect responsibility, in a room full of teammates, toward a player whose name had not been mentioned and who was now sitting in that same room absorbing the accusation in real time. Trinan's argument, to the extent that the raw emotion of the moment allowed it to be reconstructed as an argument, centered on the innings that preceded his entry into the game. His position was that the situation he had inherited, the specific base runner and score configuration that existed when Roberts handed him the ball, was not a neutral situation. It was a compromised situation. A situation that Sasaki's work in the innings before had shaped in ways that made Trinan's assignment harder than the official record of his performance reflected. He was saying that the failure was shared. That the accounting of what went wrong should not begin and end with the bullpen pitchers whose ERA would carry the damage of the game's decisive innings. That the starting pitcher whose performance had established the foundation that the bullpen was asked to protect deserved a portion of the accountability that Roberts had directed entirely at Treinen and Diaz. Whether the argument had analytical merit, whether a careful examination of the game's sequence of events would support the claim that Sasaki's contribution to the defeat was significant enough to be included in the accountability Roberts was distributing, is a separate question from the one the room was now processing. The room was processing the fact that Trinan had said it out loud. With Sasaki present. With Roberts present. With every teammate in the organization present to witness a man in professional pain making an accusation that could not be unsaid. He heard his name. He heard the accusation. He sat with it in the way that a player who has learned, through experience, through the specific discipline of competing in high-pressure environments, to receive difficult moments without allowing his external response to amplify the difficulty of the situation. But control does not mean unbothered. The people close enough to see his face in the seconds after Trinan's words landed described something that required genuine effort to maintain. The processing of being named, publicly, as a culprit in a defeat, on a day when his own assessment of his performance carried a different conclusion, was visible in the quality of his stillness. He did not respond immediately. He did not stand up. He did not direct words back at Trinan in the heat of the moment that would have escalated the confrontation into something beyond what it already was. He sat. And he waited. And what he was waiting for, without knowing it was coming, was about to arrive from a direction nobody in that room expected. This requires context. Because the image of Ohtani as someone who stays above the internal friction of a professional baseball clubhouse, who manages his public presence with extraordinary consistency, who almost never inserts himself into organizational conflicts in ways that could be characterized as taking sides, is not an inaccurate image. It reflects something real about how he operates. He does not speak in these moments. This is known. His teammates know it. His coaches know it. Roberts knows it. The organizational staff who have been around him across multiple seasons know that Ohtani's silence in difficult clubhouse situations is not disengagement. It is a considered choice, the decision of a player who understands that his presence in any room is significant enough that his voice, when it is used, carries weight that most players' voices do not carry, and that using that weight carelessly or in the wrong moment can do damage that is difficult to repair. He chooses his moments carefully. He chose this one. When he stood up, when the room registered his movement the same way it had registered Trinan's, with the immediate focused attention that Ohtani's physical presence always commands, something changed in the emotional temperature of the space. The confrontation that had been building between Trinan's accusation and Sasaki's controlled silence and Roberts' authority suddenly had a new element. The most important player in the organization had decided to speak. The room went completely quiet. This is the characteristic of his most significant moments. They do not arrive in the form that anticipation builds toward. They arrive sideways. With a clarity and a simplicity that cuts through the accumulated complexity of whatever situation they are entering and identifies the thing that actually matters. He did not defend Sasaki. Not directly. Not in the way that a teammate defending a teammate from an accusation defends, with the explicit rejection of the claim and the explicit support of the person being targeted. He did not attack Trinan. Not in the way that the emotional logic of the moment, a respected player being blamed for a situation he did not fully create, might have justified. What he did was name something that nobody else in that room had named. The thing underneath the accusations and the designations and the emergency meeting and the 3 words that had started all of it. He said the team was broken. Not the roster. Not the bullpen. Not the performance in any specific inning of any specific game. The team. The collective entity that a group of professional baseball players becomes when the trust and the communication and the shared accountability that championship baseball requires are functioning properly, and what it becomes when they are not. He said what had just happened in that room, Trinan's accusation, the public naming of Sasaki, the emotional chaos of a meeting that had moved far beyond the organizational purpose Roberts had convened it for, was not the cause of the problem. It was a symptom. Evidence of something that had been building without being addressed, that had been allowed to accumulate beneath the surface of a roster that had enough talent to win and not enough internal cohesion to consistently translate that talent into victories. He said this quietly. Without accusation directed at any individual. Without the performance of anger or disappointment that the moment might have supported. And then he said the part that made the room go silent in a different way. He said he had been watching it happen. 4 weeks. And he had stayed silent because he believed the organization would address it. He had trusted the structure, the manager, the coaches, the front office, to identify what he was seeing and respond to it before it produced exactly the kind of moment that had just occurred. That trust, he said, had not been rewarded. This is perhaps the most significant detail of everything that happened in those 11 minutes and the conversation that followed Ohtani's statement. Because Roberts has answers. His career has been built on having answers, on the ability to manage personalities and situations and the ordinary and extraordinary friction of a professional baseball season with the composure and the intelligence that define effective leadership. He did not have one here. Not because Ohtani was wrong. But because Ohtani was right in a way that the ordinary frameworks of managerial response, the tactical adjustments and the accountability conversations and the personnel decisions that Roberts had believed would address the team's problems, had not reached. The emergency meeting had been called to communicate 2 decisions. It had become something much larger. Something that would require more than an emergency meeting to resolve, more than designated assignments and pointed post-game accountability. Something that required the kind of honest organizational reckoning that Ohtani's statement had just made impossible to avoid. Trinan sat back down. The accusation he had made still hung in the room. Sasaki was still present. Roberts was still standing at the front of a meeting he had called with a clear purpose that had been overtaken by the truth of a player who chose his moment carefully and used it to say what needed to be said. Players moved through their post-game routines with the subdued quality that follows moments of genuine organizational turbulence. The equipment was packed. The showers ran. The ordinary mechanical routines of professional baseball life continued because they always continue, because the season does not pause for emergency meetings or personnel designations or the shocking statements of the most important player in the sport. Trinan left the building with the specific silence of a man whose professional status has just been fundamentally altered. Diaz left the same way. 2 pitchers. 2 careers. The machinery of their designation already in motion in ways that would not be reversed by anything that had happened in that room. Sasaki left without speaking publicly about what Trinan had said. His silence communicated something. Whether it communicated acceptance or processing or the considered restraint of a player who understood that the moment required dignity rather than response, that is a question only he can answer. And Ohtani left the way he always leaves. With the forward focus of someone who has said what needed to be said and returned his attention to what comes next. The record he had set that day was still in the books. The statement he had made in that room was still in the air. Both of them would last considerably longer than the emergency meeting that produced the second one. In baseball, as in most things, the moments that matter most are rarely the ones that were planned.